Well, hey, thank you for speaking to us. As the creator of Bob Sentry here. It is you're having such an amazing week as everyone is talking about this character.
Yeah, it's been a great week. It's been a bit of a conflicted week, because I went out to the premiere, had a chance to see the film, which is fantastic. I had previously worked on the film. I was consulting, and I had met Jake Schreier, the director, because I was explaining some of the elements of the character and working with him on that. And then to see what they had like pulled forward and made happen. I got a chance to talk with Jake again. I got a chance to meet Louis Pullman, and talk with him about the character. So it was definitely been a cool week. And at the same time, my wife had back surgery on Tuesday, the morning after. So I had to kind of be awake pretty late on Monday, get on the red eye on Tuesday, fly back to where I live in Atlanta, and make sure I got my wife through surgery. So it's been a week.
Now, it is always a silly question, especially if I'm going to ask you about your assessment of the film, because obviously you're biased. You will love this film, but is it what Jake did for your character on screen, was that more than what you expected?
No, I know. I think what Jake did was what I expected. No, let's put it this way. It's what I hoped for. And, I've had a number of consulting gigs, for example, right? And often when you're a consultant, they ignore everything that you do, but they pay you for some reason. In this case, the conversations we had about the why of the character, like why the Sentry, what does it mean? What does it mean to whom? Those conversations were pretty much in depth. So now the next question will be, okay, will they use those conversations to inform the film or will they not? Well, they absolutely did. And so it's not that I didn't expect them to, it's that you hope that this is the way it comes out, and then you find out that they've done so. Is their version of the Sentry that I created, or even the same types of conceit? Mostly, but sometimes not, because this is film, not comics, right? So you have to do things a little differently. Do they pull off the thing that they're looking to do? I think by and large, they do. This is a Marvel blockbuster, but sometimes within the framework of all these blockbusters, you can get one that's a little different, like Guardians of the Galaxy, which is about found family, or Black Panther, which has its own like meaning to an entire group of people, right?
Mhm.
And so I had often said, and I said it to Jake, I think that the Sentry represents a lot to people struggling with mental health issues and addiction. And that is always the case. That has proven to be the case. I get messages all the time from people about it. And that's the story that they made. So they made the why of the character.
So let me go to the root of the why of the character, because obviously, happy anniversary to Sentry, because it is 25 years since he first appeared on page. But you created and thought of this character way beforehand. Tell us how that actually came about. I mean, this is because
Funnily
from what I
enough,
read before, Bob was
yeah.
supposed to be just a regular guy, but he's not, obviously.
Yeah, so it's also the 30th anniversary plus of the creation of the character. It actually was created probably 5 years before it was published. Um, in those days, I had been working at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I was one of the first employees there in the offices, and then I went through that incredible explosion. And I worked as an editor. I was an editor-in-chief of a company, a couple of companies, right? And so as I was working my way through that business, I decided I wanted to be a freelance writer, and give it a shot. And I ended up writing a book called Hellblazer for DC. When that came about, I was working with, Vertigo is like the sort of adult label, and I was trying to do a character called Hour Man, which is a guy who takes a pill and it lasts for 1 hour and then he can't take it again for another day. And I just thought that would be such a great story about addiction, because he would spend the next 23 hours hoping for another pill. And when I pitched it, it never fit with Vertigo, and it sort of didn't fit in DC as well. So they just couldn't do it. I tried a lot of different ways to pitch it. I pitched it to Marvel and DC probably twice each. But I happened to be lucky enough to work with Jay Lee, and we won an Eisner Award for Inhumans. And when that happened, Marvel and Marvel Knights said, you can really kind of tell us what you guys would like to do. And I asked Jay, will you take this character on that has basically been turned down a few times, understandably? And he said, yeah, I think this is a great story. I just thought it was an important story even then. And so it's my style to kind of turn down Spider-Man and turn down the Avengers or whatever it was they were asking and do something like that. And look what happened. So it's a long time in creation, but 25 years after its first publication or so, here we are, and he means so much to a lot of people.
What what do you suppose is the idea behind of like dark storytelling of especially like mental health? This is something that when we think of like comics, we think of superhero action, good guys versus bad guys and all this kind of stuff. But you're telling a much more complex story, and especially where we think like, comic books are for kids, but now we're introducing this not just for kids, but for adults and everyone else.
I never did tell that comic book story because I have this kind of odd background. I grew up in the West Country of Great Britain and I didn't get comics. We couldn't afford it. Came from, single mother. My father left when I was 5, and I came from a background of a family that had a lot of mental health issue challenges and a lot of addiction issue challenges, right? And so I was in it, and for whatever reason, I was like a little unicorn. It just didn't affect me. I wasn't worried about it. I lived it. I was fine with it, right? And so when I came into comics, I was lucky enough before I was a writer to be an editor to some pretty amazing people. Alan Moore, for example, I was his editor on a book called Big Numbers, which is like his unfinished magnum opus. But he did From Hell, V for Vendetta. These are all things that have come into the world. And plenty of other really great comic book creators that I was like an editor for before I did it professionally as a writer. And so I was able to see the stuff. Like I remember, I was like, I was Kent Williams' editor, and Kent Williams worked on a book called Havoc and Wolverine that was this fully painted version of these superheroes. To me, then I didn't I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way, but I didn't have this reverence for superheroes. I didn't have a thing that I thought you shouldn't do with superheroes, and I certainly didn't have no interest in having a story where one guy punches the other guy hardest and the other guy falls over. Like that's boring. So I've only ever done the way of characters, and I think that we were given that freedom at Marvel Knights by Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. When they came in, they allowed us to write that type of story.
So, when you came up with the concept of Sentry and Void with Jay, can you talk about the costume concept? Because that the costume is like almost like a throwback of the old comics in its own way.
Right. So in the original pitch, which again was quite some time before Jay had seen the thing, it was always. So I'm going to give you a little bit of insight here, actually, because the reason for the reason for the old style comics is more than would appear. On the face of it, in the first story, the idea was that he'd always been around. He was a contemporary of the Fantastic Four. He was one of the first superheroes. And that he'd made himself forget so that the Void and the Sentry would not fight forever, right? So the marketing campaign revolved around that, and so we had all these versions of the original Sentry, the Golden Guardian of Good. These things are kind of absurd, but they meant something, right? That when he was the Golden Guardian of Good standing on the parapet of the watchtower with a watchdog, like all of this illiterate names and all of these silly kind of ideas, he was perfect and he didn't cast a shadow. But at the same time, the void existed, a creature of infinite darkness, because he was both at the same time. It was all about duality of a person. And so when it came to the design of the old style comics, here's the background that most people don't know. If you think about comics, which we relayed in the Century, they begin with a creation and this kind of like fun, here it is, right? Then they get into experimentation in the 70s, 60s and 70s, where anything goes. They're like hippie comics and crazy stuff, right? It's basically an acid trip. And then in the 80s, it gets a bit more down to earth. It all comes back down to earth with the kind of Alan Moore style comics and a lot of these things. In the 90s, it got very difficult. The industry was all about collectible editions, and they went up and then went bankrupt. So it was kind of like the nastiest time. Not to say there weren't good comics there, but it was. And then in the 2000s, we were part of its recovery, right? Well, that mirrors a drug and addiction experience. You start with a thing, you anything goes, now you come down to earth, now it's really nasty, and now you have to recover. And that was intentionally put forward so that he could be the Sentry through all these eras, and it reflected his addiction.
Wow. So it's ironically you're portraying a cycle, a never-ending
Mm.
cycle,
Yep.
for Sentry and Void in this case.
Yeah, and in fact, that is a cycle of comics in some ways. That very famously, Will Eisner, the creator of the Spirit, said comics has died like 50 times in my lifetime. You know, it goes up and then it goes down, and this cycle of stuff like happens. So we took the overall cycle of comics and said, look what it is. It mirrors a drug experience. You know.
Wow. So in the case of moving forward with the comics in this case, because I think I read that it technically ended, didn't it? Or are we still going to continue on?
No, no, it didn't end. No, what happened was we wrote a very contained sort of seven issue series, right?
Yeah.
And it sort of ends where it begins, where Bob has realized that I can't be the Sentry because it means I have to be the Void. And I always felt pretty proud of that one thing, which is he heroism is a particular thing, isn't it? He gives up his heroism in order to save the world from the void. That's the ultimate act of heroism. Heroism isn't the Sentry. Heroism isn't, or the evil isn't the void. The hero of the story is Bob, right? It's always Bob. So we ended it that way, and then a couple of years later, I think Brian Bendis was looking to populate the new Avengers, just technically in the comics, and he told me at one point that someone had said there are no good new characters, and he said that's absurd. There are plenty of good new characters, and he brings back the Sentry, and he actually made me a character in the book. So the Sentry gets to meet his own creator in this really crazy meta thing. After that, I wrote a second series that I'm equally proud of. It was very much about how how we learn about our own selves and how we see our own humanity and what does that mean in the event of our mental health. And then after that, like anything goes right now. So now the Sentry's in the books all the time, and yes, he's overpowered, but the whole point of the character is that he can't use his power because he's overpowered. And so there's a lot to be done with him, and I think that's the way forward with him.
So let me backtrack a little bit because you talk about heroism. I want you to define heroism to the rest
Oh
of
yeah. Well, I have a good college lecture version because I teach, right? It's that heroism is not running into battle with a stogie in your mouth and a machine gun blazing, right? That's stupidity, right? Heroism is running into battle thinking of your family at home and being afraid and still doing it. And that's where Bob's heroism came from. That's generally the way that I would always write heroic characters. I would always write villains as people that you would kind of agree with, except you just don't agree with their methods, you know? And so if you do that, it has a much more rounded way of existing, you know?
And this is one of the things that people have been debating, even after watching the film or even before the film, is whether Sentry Boyd is a good guy or a bad guy. I mean, what? I mean, it is definitely complex.
Yeah, great. It's complex, right? Because look, okay, let me ask you this question. I hate to return it back on you, right? But are you a good guy or a bad guy? I mean, you might see, you know, who is a good guy and not a bad guy a bit? Who's a bad guy and not a good guy a bit? I mean, it just speaks to a theme that I think we have spoken about since people sat around fires and looked at the sky and talked about stuff and went through the ideas of philosophy, right? You know, are we good and bad? What's the nature of evil, right? Is it a choice that we make? Is it something we can't control? So, you know, the question of is he a good guy or a bad guy? I will tell you this. I think that the reason it speaks so much to people struggling with mental health issues is that sometimes people dealing with like a chemical imbalance or who've developed a personality disorder, what happens to them is they ask themselves, like, what am I good? Am I bad because of this? You know, if I'm flawed, does that make me a bad person? Right. And so there's a great answer to that, which is the best stories do not end with an answer, they end with a question.
Hmm. Wow. And I know you can't reveal anything after after Thunderbolts was actually revealed, but what would you like to see? Would you like to see more of Sentry Void, down the road in this MCU universe?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously everyone knows that it's been put forward that Sentry will be part of the Avengers film, so that's fantastic, right? Um, Yes, I had a chance to talk to one of the producers that I knew before because I'd worked on the film. I'm lucky to be in a position where I do get to work on the future iterations a little bit. And to me, I think people will discover whether or not there can be an iteration of just a Sentry movie. Like we don't know, right? I think Thunderbolts did a really good job of talking about mental health and asking for help and things like that. So. But in the event that it happens, this is where I'll say no, no spoilers, right? Because I know what I want to do. I have a number of ways in which I think the Sentry can really be brought forward, where the things that you and I have discussed will really come out of a film. The ending in a question like who are we, why are we, that kind of thing. Those are the things that have you walking out of a theater and talking to the other person and go, wow, let's talk about that, as opposed to, well, that happened, but now they've so put a bow on it. So hopefully we can build some of those ideas out.
Now, a lot of comic book fans, they always drool over the costume of Sentry, especially when it was revealed in Thunderbolts. I want to hear from you. What did you think of that costume?
Yeah, I always think that the costume in live action, this is same as true of Captain America, right? I don't know that the costume can ever be, no disrespect to the films, but it can never be the comic book one because the fact is that when the comics are drawn, everything's always perfect, right? So there's no folds and wrinkles and stuff, the hat kind of moving sideways. It's always there because the way the characters are drawn. So when you see the costume in the film, it can be or it can seem a little different from your concept that you're very used to because there's not as much smooth lines, there's facial stuff, there's movement, there's wrinkles in the clothes, right? That being said, the way that they presented it, I think was a pretty good version of what the whole point of the costume was. It was supposed to be that he was like literally a throwback, the golden guardian of good that could stand there on the parapet and like look across the city with his cape blowing. That's what they did in the film. So I'm pretty happy with it. But the way that I write, I like to rough him up a little bit.
And how did you enjoy Louis Pullman's portrayal of Bob on screen?
Well, it again, I got to talk to Jake, but I got to talk to Lewis at the after party, right? And I had this funny thing, I've said it in a couple of interviews now that like, Jake calls me over to talk to me and I'm like, aren't you busy, mate? Like you just directed like a really massive movie, but he wanted to talk to me. I got introduced to Lewis and Lewis was a really nice guy. And he's like, Paul, I've really wanted to meet you. And so we talked about what this was. And I told him, look, man, and that sounds weird, right? I think it was weird in hindsight, but I said, I know this sounds weird, but man, I'm proud of you, because I got to tell you what's going to happen in your life, I think, and I'm really hopeful this character makes a big difference to your career. But what's going to happen in your life is that you will meet all of the people that come to me and say, the Sentry means a lot to me, or the Sentry changed my life, or I struggle with my mental health. And Lewis, that's all coming in your direction, man. And I hope that's a positive experience for you. And I hope it's not a burden, but I do think that you nailed it. I think that he brought the things that are needed for Bob, right? He's vulnerable, he's scared, he doesn't know the answer to anything because who of us knows the answer to anything?
Do fans approach you with the same thing and be thankful that you created a character like this?
All the time. I mean, I get it on a daily basis. I get message after message. So many people. Look, we all live in this fractured time, right? Like politics is really difficult. People don't know how to talk to each other anymore. Social media tears people apart. The more, the more connected we are, the more disconnected we are. And if it's the information superhighway, right, then how are we navigating it on pogo sticks? Like people, this whole thing with social media and the news cycle. And so because everybody is dealing with that, I think everybody is struggling with, to an extent, with their mental health, right? Everyone. And so I do get approached all the time and I get messaged and I get emails and I get messages on social media like thank you for creating the Sentry. Thank you because this is my character. And I love that.
So true, so true. And one more major thing with you, Paul, because I've talked to a lot of comic book creators, multiple times, like with Rob Liefeld and everything like that. Every time they take one of their characters and put it on screen, I want to hear from you, like what kind of reaction when you first got the news that they're going to put, this character onto the big screen?
Okay, so first of all, it's sort of like not my first rodeo because I had created the origin of Wolverine for Marvel, and I have had my stuff used all over the place, and I've been through Ninja Turtles, so I can remember. I know this is related, I promise you, but I remember when the first Ninja Turtle movie came out, and we had the world premiere, the premiere that we had, and there was a moment where it said created by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, and I'm sitting next to Kevin, who remains one of my best friends. And couldn't have been more proud, right? Like, this was like great. I was like emotional because it was so cool. So I will tell you that when the Sentry came out, I happened to be in San Diego and Kevin Feige was there. This is before they made all the big films, right? I meet Kevin, they probably made one or two of them, and I'm introduced to him, and he looked me in the eye and he said, I want you to know something, Paul. I think Sentry's our best movie. Now that's 25 years ago, but I think that Kevin had always known that the Sentry was a really good character that would mean a lot to a lot of people, right? So now you kind of fast forward and it's been 25 years since it happened and it got there. But there is a moment, right? There's a moment that, and it wasn't the moment when he first appeared. I'd seen the trailers and I knew what he would look like and all that stuff. I think there's a moment in the film that everyone will recognize, and I won't spoil it, but there is a moment where the humanity of the characters in plural, and specifically Florence Pugh's character, when that becomes so evident in the way that they're dealing with this problem, and she and Bob connect in the way that they do, I've had a number of people tell me they cried their eyes out about what happened on screen. So that's pretty cool.
It's definitely not just a regular action, but you have to bring tissues onto something like this. So, Paul, just to wrap things up on the comic book side, where are we heading now with all of this?
Where am I heading, or where is the
Yeah,
Sentry heading?
where is Sentry heading, and where are you heading?
Yeah, Sentry, I think now, once it kind of gets its imprint in the Marvel Universe, right? I think that's a way to do it, right? And I think, if you just kind of go and do comic-y stuff with it that doesn't have as much meaning, in my opinion, right, then really you're wasting it. If they do stuff that has more of the kind of why of the character, then I think that's useful. Um, I'm like a different cat, right? Because I've done a lot of comics and people know me for a lot of comics, but what people sometimes know me for as well is game design and game writing. I've actually done 6 platinum selling games. I work across different media. I'm one of the few people that does all media. So I do film, animation, comic, television, video games, but I do a lot of new media stuff. And so comics are a part of my life. And I'm talking to a couple of people about doing some comic work right now, which is cool. But I'm working a little bit in new media, game design, storytelling, actually, like finding new ways to tell stories through games. Um, and so I'm like the guy that walked by the march of the beat of his own drum. I do have some comic projects planned, but I have everything planned, unfortunately.
I'm imagining there is some kind of alter ego of you out there too, going back and forth because you have a hand in everything. So, Paul,
Yeah.
thank you very much for speaking to us about Sentry, the Thunderbolts, and everything. You have an amazing week, and you know what? You have a busy week. Let me rephrase that. So,
Thank you very
thank
much. I appreciate it. Thanks for chatting.